It's a good day to brew, baby. What is up, YouTube? It's your boy Millsy, back with Hometown Commander, back for another episode of Millsy Brews, the show where I brew my version 1.0 deck list of Commander in front of us on my quest to brew the magic. Well, as always, the deck list is going to be down in the description for you below. As well as I'd really appreciate it if you can interact with the video, like, comment, subscribe, check out those links in the description. I'd really appreciate it. We're moving and finishing up our first full week of the regular Bloomborough brews, and today we're talking about Camellia, the Seedmiser. A 3-mana Golgari Squirrel Warlock 3/3 with Menace that gives all of our other squirrels Menace. It says whenever you sack one or more foods, we'll make a 1/1 squirrel token, and we can pay 2 mana and forage to put a counter on each other squirrel you control. In order to forage, we either got to sacrifice a food or exile 3 cards from our graveyard. So not only are we going to be playing the squirrel tribal type thing, we're also going to be caring about food. So we've got some things in the deck that both make and pay off us using the things with food, whether we use foods for the other ability or use foods for Camellia's ability to forage. The whole goal here is to do the squirrels thing, but we're also going to kind of pull in these food and aristocrats payoffs to kind of make a cohesive game plan. I always like to mention, especially when we start dealing with commanders that are in specific archetypes, that I don't believe that Camellia will ever outproduce something like Chatterfang when it comes to aristocrats. What I think Camellia wants to do is try to play with the food more and utilize the food better than I think Chatterfang, which is a more combo-centric commander, will do. So if you're looking for a more combo-centric aristocrats commander, I would suggest you move over to Chatterfang. I did that up on the channel this week. But if you're looking for more of that squirrel tribal, really take advantage of more of the flavor, I think Camellia is more up your alley. And it's funny because on the first page for the squirrels, we're going to talk about Chatterfang. Chatterfang is probably one of the most important squirrels that's ever been printed, just for what it does. If one or more tokens would be created under your control, you make those many tokens plus that many 1/1 squirrels. We can sack some squirrels to target down potentially a creature. Chatterfang is a house of value in itself, and it would be dumb to not play it in any squirrel deck. Whether you brewed Hazel right next to it, Camellia that we're talking about today, or you chose to do it on its own, I think Chatterfang is just one of those cards that belongs there. Not only because it makes you squirrel tokens, but because it gives you the options to use those squirrel tokens for your benefit. Hazel of the Root Bloom, the commander of the Squirrel Precon this time around that we talked about on the channel last week. Of course, we're going to play it as well. First, because it can tap tokens to make mana. Note that that doesn't say creature tokens. That could be any tokens. We can tap our food, treasures, clues, squirrels, anything we want to use to make mana. And then at the beginning of our end step, we can make a token that's a copy of another token we control. And if it's a squirrel, we get 2 copies of it. So Hazel works really well here in the 99 to make tokens, but also tap for mana. Hazel's Brewmaster over there on the right says whenever it enters or attacks, we exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard and make a food. So this can start taking potentially key things out of our opponent's graveyards and making foods for it. And then it says foods you control have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Hazel's Brewmaster. This, to me, is kind of an interesting rider, right, to this ability. I think Hazel's Brewmaster is worth it alone on its ability to make foods, especially when we look at what Camellia can do with foods, making us a squirrel and potentially putting counters on all of them. What I like about Brewmaster is specifically if you're playing against decks that have a lot of creatures with activated abilities, we can kind of take and use them to our benefit. I think that's important as a rider for what's already a really good ability and something we can already take advantage of. Scurry of Squirrels is kind of one of my new favorite squirrels that got printed here in Bloomborough. It has double Myriad, which is a very interesting ability, making 2 copies of it, attacking all other players that it attacks. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can put a counter on another creature you control. Camellia is already trying to spread out counters, so counters is something we at least minimally care about. But what I find interesting about Scurry of Squirrels is you could potentially get 3 or 4 of these +1/+1 counter triggers each turn, and start stacking counters up on different creatures, making other creatures and or Camellia a threat. And remember that with Camellia out, these Myriad copies now have Menace, which makes them harder to block, meaning we're probably going to potentially get in for more damage. And hopefully we have other buffs making them bigger. The Odd Acorn Gang is the alternate commander from that Squirrel Precon, and an interesting card. It has Menace, Trample, and Reach, 5/5 for 5, a nice body. Squirrels you control have a tap. Target squirrel gets +2/+2 and gains Trample until end of turn. Activate on sorcery. very interesting ability, right? Because now we could tap our squirrel tokens to make one of our other squirrels bigger. That seems pretty cool. Whenever one or more squirrels deal common damage to a player, we draw a card. I mean, this is a nice package of value. I think the only thing that stops me for wanting to make Ade and Korgang its own commander is just that lack of ways to produce squirrels, but I think it works really well in the 99 of any of these three main squirrel commanders we're talking about. Toski, Bearer of Secrets, just feels right for a deck like this. It is a squirrel, so it can be grown with Camellia, making it pretty scary because it has to block, it has to attack each combat if able, and it has Indestructible, so it's going to be a good attacker. And whenever it deals whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, we draw a card. So another one of these drawing cards as our creatures get in, and Toski can be a threat on its own if it gets big enough in a deck like this. One of my new favorite payoffs for squirrels in the new set, and a card I think is going to get kind of scary as these squirrel decks go wider and wider, is Valley Rockcaller. It says when it attacks, each opponent loses X life and we gain X life, where X is the number of other squirrels, bats, lizards, or rats we control. Well, this is really important in this deck because we're kind of making these squirrel tokens and going wide, but also going slightly tall. If we're hitting Rockcaller for 5, 6, 7 life every turn, I mean, it's going to help us really push the game forward as we threaten our opponents. Chitter Spitter is a great one. Beating our upkeep, we can sack a token. If we do, we put an acorn counter on it. Squirrels get +1/+1 for each acorn counter on it, and then you can tap it to make a squirrel. What I really like with Camellia in conjunction with Chitter Spitter is if we sack a food to Chitter Spitter, we actually get the 1/1 squirrel from Camellia, and we would get this acorn counter on Chitter Spitter. So it's kind of a way to kind of take our foods and put them into something else if we want to, but still get tokens and a buff for all of our squirrels out of it. And this is one of those cards and one of those times where you'd be very surprised how much just a +3/+3 or +4/+4 buff can do across an entire board of these squirrels, really threatening your opponents and having them forced to deal with it. Squirrel Nest is an aura that can go on a land and it just taps to make a squirrel. That's really something we can just do every turn if we don't need that land for something else, and those tokens will definitely add up over time. So we kind of talked about how we're going to make squirrels, or how we're going to care about squirrels, but how are we going to make the foods, right? Because the food tokens are important. We have something like a caddy manufacturer, which is going to take our food production and triple it, right? Clues, foods, and treasures get created instead of just one of them. The big keyword there is we could get foods and treasures at the same time, which is important. Treasures for more mana. Clues can help us with some card draw, but the clues aren't as important. The only nice thing about the clues is for things like Hazel, or some of the cards we're going to talk about later, where we could potentially tap tokens for mana, we can still tap the clues for mana, although the foods and the treasures, right, are a teeny bit more important to us. Gilded Goose can tap for 1 and a green to make a food, or tap to sack a food to add a mana of any color. Gilded Goose feels like a nice way to make a food every turn if it need be, for just 2 mana. And if you have anything else that amplifies that, like Chatterfang or anything else that adds extras or riders on top of it, then that 2 mana is going a long way. Another great food producer, and another way to sacrifice foods as well, is Peregrine took from the Lord of the Rings set. If you would make 1 or more tokens under your control, create 1 or more tokens into your control, those tokens plus an additional food are created instead. And then this is great because then you can sack 3 foods to draw a card. Well, Camellia says whenever you sack 1 or more foods, you make a squirrel. So if we have to force to use those foods to draw cards off Peregrine, we're still making the squirrels. Otherwise, we're getting food every time we make a squirrel, and we're making sure that we always have lots of them around in order to use them. Pippin, Warden of Isengard from that Lord of the Rings set as well, can pay 1 and tap to make a food. So again, another kind of way to make a food every turn. And then we can tap and sack 4 foods to give out all of our other creatures +3/+3 and haste until end of turn, which is an interesting ability. And again, depending on how wide we are, could really produce a big effect. Nuka Cola, a vending machine, a pricey card, but I think it's well worth it in our deck. 1 and a tap to make a food, and whenever we sacrifice a food, we get a tap treasure, and that's really 2 great abilities. 1, I mean, obviously we can make the food, and that's great, but turning all foods into treasures when we sacrifice them is even better, because then we can use those treasures on future turns. And as we get towards the end and talk about some of these aristocrat payoffs we have, well, we have aristocrat payoffs for sacrificing artifacts, so those treasures become important too. The other fun part is if you had this out at the same time as Academy Manufacturer, when you make that treasure, you'd be making food again as well. And then Witch's Oven, you can sack a creature to make a food, but if the sacrificed creature's toughness was 4 or greater, we make 2 foods instead. Of course, one half of a very popular standard deck at the time it released. Witch's Oven just feels good to sack a squirrel into this to make a food if we need it. And if we go longer into the game, we could sack some of these squirrels that are getting buffed by other abilities to get multiple foods. But again, just a way to turn creature tokens into foods, and we have ways to turn foods into other things. So you could see there's kind of this cohesive process as we're taking all of these tokens and using them for different things. But as far as food payoffs go, if things like Jaheira and Night of the Sweet's Revenge, which each allow foods to tap for mana. Jaheira actually lets all tokens tap for green mana, which is a great ability. Squirrel tokens, clues, foods, treasures, anything else you can think of are all going to be able to tap for green mana, and that is really helpful. Night of the Sweet's Revenge, when it comes in, we get a food token. Foods can tap for green, and then we can pay 7 mana to sack it to give all creatures +X until end of turn, where X is the number of foods we control. So that is an important ability, depending on what our board set looks like. If we have a ton of food laying around and we can take a big alpha strike, I mean, it might be worth the 7 mana to do. Worst case scenario, we're just allowing all of our foods to tap for mana. And then Killer Service seems like a nice, fun way to pay off Camellia's second ability. Whenever it ETBs, we make a number of foods equal to the number of opponents we have, right? More often than not, that's going to be 3. And then at the beginning of your end step, you can pay 2 and sack a token. If you do, you make a 4/4 Rhino. This is interesting for 2 reasons. We can turn a food into a rhino, or we can turn a squirrel into a rhino, whichever way we want to do it. But I think with Camellia, right, it makes more sense to turn the foods into rhinos, still get our 1/1 token off of Camellia, and now have a 4/4 rhino that's a little bit bigger and a little bit harder for our opponents to deal with. We get to do this once per turn, and it can be a way to kind of start having another threat in our board for our opponents to deal with. The deck has a couple Aristocrats pieces in it. These aren't the only 3. These are just the 3 that I kind of wanted to talk about, because it's still important to have some of these abilities, and you're going to notice that some of these are the more pricey cards on the deck, but they're very good at what they do. Agent of the Iron Throne is probably my favorite of all of them in the deck, just because it plays double duty. It says commander creatures you own have, when an artifact or creature you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses a life. So only while Camellia and Agent are out at the same time, anytime we sack an artifact or creature, they die, they go to the graveyard through any other means, each opponent loses a life. Sack a food, lose a life. Sack a token, lose a life. I really like Age of the Iron Throne, and in a deck like this where we care so much about foods, I think it is really important. Bashed Remembrance is just for creatures. When a creature we control dies, each opponent loses a life and we gain a life. And then Meat Hook can come in as a midi board wipe, but otherwise, whenever a creature we control dies, each opponent loses a life, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, we gain a life. The life gain isn't as important. What mainly is important here is if someone's going to kill our creatures, or if we're going to sacrifice our own creatures, we're going to pay our opponents for it by doing it. But I've said it before on the show, and I'll say it again. No deck's ever complete. This is my version 1.0 shot at Camellia, and I think there's a lot of things we can learn from testing Camellia, which is 1, how dependent are we on foods, and 2, how well are our squirrels going to do as a tribe. So for these 3 cards I would consider bringing back into the deck. I think all 3 of them fit one of those 2 bills. Bristleblood Farmer says when it comes in, you make 2 foods, and whenever it attacks, you may sack a food. If you do, mill 3 and put a permanent from among them into your hand. It makes sense to 4 mana for 2 foods and this potential ability later. I get it. Again, if I'm looking for more ways to make foods more consistently, maybe it's worth bringing something like this in. But I think if we're going to do that, we could do it a lot more consistency with something like Guillaume Master Chef. At the beginning of your end step, we create a number of food tokens equal to the number of non-token creatures we had enter the battlefield this turn. Kind of an interesting ability. If we could take a big turn playing multiple creatures, this can be good. And then for 1 mana, you can sack a food to give a creature indestructible and turn to turn and tap it. Here's a way to sack a food for Camellia's ability to still get the squirrel and protect something. I think of the 3 of these, Guillaume probably is the one that comes back in the quickest. It's just one of those problems where it's hard to find that specific spot until you do some testing and realize where you kind of had too much of. And then Squirrel Sovereign, just giving a flat buff to all other squirrels. Again, seems really good. I think we have enough of it with Camellia's ability to start handing out counters and some of the other things we have in the deck. But if we notice we need a little bit more of it, well, then we bring the Sovereign in for the buff. But let's get into our play tests of the deck. Keeping a 3-lander with Chatterfang, Marionette Apprentice, another Aristocrat's ability we have, which says whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into the battlefield graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses a life. So another one of these big aristocrat abilities. Witch's Oven, and then a Ravenous Squirrel, which grows every time we sacrifice an artifact or a creature. Turn 1, we see a Chatter of the Squirrel, which can make a squirrel and then flashback to make a squirrel again. I think a couple ways we can approach this. I think I'd like to just Path of Ancestry here. We can always Squirrel and Witch's Oven next turn or Apprentice next turn. But let's get this in. It does tap for both of our colors, and sometimes it's good to take a turn to set up. Turn 2, we draw a Garrick, Cursed Huntsman. This came in the precon for the Squirrels, and I think it's a great card. The 0 makes 2 wolves that when they die, they each put a loyalty counter on Garrick. Garrick can destroy a target creature and draw a card, or his -6 if we can get up to it quickly, which we could potentially in one turn if someone kills those wolves and doesn't damage it, can give it everything +3/+3 and trample. A great ability and a great top end. Here, I think I kind of like playing the Squirrel and the Witch's Oven. I can see the world where you just play Marionette Apprentice here, but I kind of like this. This is something we can get into Camellia turn 3, and then work our way towards trying to get this process started of getting a food and kind of playing fun. As soon as we can get Chatterfang down too, then we can really have fun with making foods and making squirrels. So turn 3, we'll play that Swamp, and I think I'm just content to get Camellia down here. Again, we need to get a token so we can start the Witch's Oven train. And Ravenous Squirrel could be that, potentially, if we want to. But at the moment, I kind of see no reason to start it unless we know we're not going to draw anything better. Because there's a world where next turn we could just play Chatterfang, sack the squirrel to the Witch's Oven, make a food, make a squirrel, and be on our way towards getting that process started. So I kind of just like to wait, make sure we understand, what we're looking for. Turn 4, we see a Mirkwood Bat. So no mana for it, unfortunately. So I think I would play Chatterfang. Remember that Camellia says all of the squirrels have menace, and then whenever we sacrifice one or more foods, we make that squirrel. So I think what makes the most sense here is to just sack the squirrel to the oven. The Ravenous Squirrel to the oven. It feels weird because the squirrel can get bigger, but I kind of want to get this process started now. I have other ways to make squirrels. I can keep, getting more squirrels in. But I don't know. My gut tells me I should get the process started. This could be a mistake, but I think we try it. So we'd make a food, and then Chatterfang will make us that squirrel. And now Camellia can start making us squirrels once we sack those foods. And we can take an attack with Camellia here if we want to. On turn 4 with Menace, I'm sure there's somebody we can hit potentially. But next turn, we could pay 2 and sack that food to make a squirrel. And then put a counter on each other squirrel. Seems like a great way to get the party started. So turn 5, no other land. That's brutal, but that's okay. We can keep the party going with 3 mana. Like I said, I like the idea of foraging to put some counters. So I think I would just go ahead and Chatter of the Squirrel. This is going to make me a squirrel, but remember that Chatterfang's also going to make a squirrel when that happens. And then I think I would pay the other 2 to sack this food to forage, right, with Camellias, to put a counter on every squirrel. Now, because there's a colon there, Camellia's second ability, their third ability there, is actually going to trigger if I want to before I resolve this. Because foraging is a part of the cost of the ability, the trigger should still hit the stack, making me a squirrel, which will make me another squirrel with Chatterfang. And now I'm going to go ahead and put a counter on every other squirrel. So Camellia doesn't give it. Now all of these have counters on them. So now they're all 2/2s. A couple of these came in this turn, right? We had 4 of them come in this turn. But hey, Chatterfang could take an attack here. A squirrel could take an attack here. We see them having menace. But again, now we're potentially set up the next turn to keep this party going. Maybe something like Marionette Apprentice to sack a squirrel to the Witch's Oven to get a food and a squirrel, and then use the food to forage again. That could be a good little loop where we're starting to get damage to our opponent. Turn 6, we see an Oak Hollow Village. We can tap it for a green, only to cast a creature. And then we can tap it for a green to put a counter on each frog, rabbit, raccoon, or squirrel you control that ETB this turn. So if we actually have enough mana, we might be able to really help out the squirrels that came in this turn. So what I do need 2 mana to do that forage ability. So I actually don't think we can do that how I want to do it. I still think it's worth playing the Apprentice, but I'm not going to be able to do the Ocala Village this turn. So I'll pay 2 to pay the Apprentice. I'm going to go ahead and sack one of these Squirrels to the Witch's Oven to make a food. Which the Marionette Apprentice, I'm sorry, when it comes in, I'll have it make me that servo. And I just realized I should be probably sacrificing that servo instead, right? And then, sorry, that would have made another squirrel because of Chatterfang. But we sack it to make food, right? Which makes another squirrel because of Chatterfang. And then everybody's going to lose a life because that servo went to the graveyard. And then I'm going to pay 2 into that Camellia to forage, making... putting the +1/+1 counters, but I'm gonna make a squirrel there. Chatterfang makes me a squirrel, and now every other squirrel is gonna get a counter. We can see, some of those squirrels starting to get big. The nice part is then these can potentially get put into the oven to make 2 foods instead of 1. These all being 3/3 now seems like nice lethal threats with Menace. I mean, we're really just one or 2 more turns away from starting to get to be a nuisance for our opponents and probably starting to get very difficult to deal with. But turn 7 here, nothing too good to do my mana with. I kind of like the idea of Tarian's Journal to sack something to draw a card. Maybe we can get into another. Land. But I would just go ahead and do the same thing. 2 mana to play the Journal. Sack one of these squirrels to the Witch's Oven to make a food and a squirrel. And then go ahead and pay 2 into Camellia's ability to sack the food to make a squirrel and do that forage ability. Remember, we get another squirrel because of Chatterfang, and then put a counter on all of them. And as you can start to see, this squirrel army is growing, and it's growing darn fast. If we had an extra mana, we could leave it up for Chatterfang to use it for some removal. But I kind of think I might just also sack one of these squirrels that came in this turn for the Journal to draw a card. And unfortunately, we didn't get a land there. That was my hope, but that's okay. Now we have a couple 4/4s, we have a couple 3/3s. Take another big attack here. We could do it all in one person. If we wanted with Menace, we can kind of decide what we want to do. We're kind of one overrun or one trampler settle up a way of just, being in good shape. But again, these are just going to get bigger and bigger over the course of our turn. Now we can forage multiple times in a turn once we start doing that. So I'm just going to show that this turn. We actually get the Viridescent Fog, which is cool. But let's do it. Let's say we want to try to forage multiple times in a turn. What we're going to do is sacrifice one of these big squirrels to the Witch's Oven, which is going to make me 2 foods, right? Instead of 1, right? But then because I made 2 foods, I'm going to make 2 squirrels, right, with Chatterfang. Now I have enough mana to go ahead and forage twice, because the forage rate does cost me 2 mana. So I'd pay 2, sack one of these foods to make a squirrel, right, which makes another squirrel because of Chatterfang. And then we're going to go ahead and put a counter, right, on all of them. And then I kind of see no reason not to just forage again, especially with these having Menace. Forage again, make a squirrel, make another squirrel, right, because of Chatterfang. And then, put some counters. And, we got those triggers because of the Apprentice. Now all of these are 6/6s, all of these are 5/5s. Here's now a big attack at one of our opponents. And I think this is an interesting kind of scenario where now you're just overrunning the board with squirrels. But let's get into playtest number 2. I think we kind of got ourselves to a natural understanding point, on what our end goal was there. Keeping a 3-lander with that squirrel, Odd Acorn Gang, the Revenant Squirrel, Chatterstorm, which can make some squirrels and Storm, and then that Killer Service. So not a bad start. Drawing a Swamp will get the So up in turn 1, I'm realizing that shifting woodland's going to come in tapped at the moment, but I already made my decisions. We'll play that Ravenous Squirrel. Turn 2, we see a Viridescent Bog. Let's get that shifting woodland in tapped, I guess, now, because I really don't have anything to do on turn 2 here. I could Chatterstorm, but I really don't see the point. I'd kind of like to save it for a future turn and try to use it maybe when I can play multiple spells on one turn. Turn 3, we see a 3-tree city, a great land, tapping for the amount of squirrels we have. But we'll get Camellia down here, and now we could attack with the squirrel if we want for somebody for Menace on turn 3. Well, again, we're just trying to build our board, maybe get up to the Acorn Gang, get up to maybe getting Killer Service down and getting it started. Because I think here on turn 4, Killer Service makes the most sense. It's going to come in and make us 3 foods, right? Because in this scenario, we're going to have 3 opponents. We're not going to have the 2 mana at the end step to make a Rhino or use Camellia to forage, but I think now we're in a good spot. We've got some foods, saved up, and we can kind of work towards this. Take another attack with the Squirrel if we want. Take an attack with Camellia if we want. Again, they both have Menace, and if we have the attacks, we might as well take them. Turn 5, let's get the Swamp down. I mean, there's a world where we just Acorn Gang and potentially draw a couple cards, right? Pay 5 into the Acorn Gang. And on turn 5, there is a world where either of these could get in unblocked because of Menace. Let's say, just for the purpose of this, we managed to get 1 in. So we'll draw a card. And again, no forage, no Killer Service on the end step. But that's okay, we're building. And now we have somebody like the Odd Acorn Gang, which can start to be a threat for us. Turn 6, we'll play another land. I guess the question is, do we want to play 3-tree city? It's only 3 at the moment. Let's play it just in case it matters something here this turn. We'll play the Vine Reap Mentor. When it comes in or dies, make a food. So we get another food. I've got 4 mana left. I can forage. And I could Chatterstorm here. Chatterstorm would make me 2 squirrels. And then I could just go ahead and forage and put some counters. That doesn't seem too bad. Let's do that. Let's make a squirrel, and then we get a copy because we cast a spell before it this turn. And then I would just go ahead and forage to Camellia's ability, making another squirrel. Counter. 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 Take an attack with the Odd Acorn Gang, having Trample and Menace. We're going to hit for sure. The squirrel, I'm going to guess, is going to hit potentially. Maybe not on turn 6, but I think the Acorn Gang hits for sure. We attack with Camellia if we can. Let's just say, again, if there's this, we just get at least 1 card. Again, can't use the 2 mana at the end step to forage, or to use the ability. I'm realizing we probably could have done the 3-tree city to forage twice, but that's okay. We can focus on doing it then this turn. We see Parallel Lives, which is great. We could do 4 mana for the Parallel Lives, 2 mana into 3-tree city to add 7 mana, right? Because we have 7 squirrels. And we could really forage 3 times, making 2 squirrels every time, right? So forage, make 2 squirrels, right? Forage, make 2 squirrels because of the Parallel Lives, making us 2. Counters, counter, counter, forage again, right, for 2 more mana. Make 2 more squirrels, right? Counters, counters. And this is, I think, where the deck really is going to shine, is foraging for this. And then forage 1 more time, making 2 more squirrels. Counters, counters, counters. We got 1 mana left. That's okay. Remember, the Odd Acorn Gang says Squirrels we control have tap. Target squirrel gets +2/+2 and trample until end of turn. Well, the question becomes, right, these ones can't tap, right, because they came in this turn. We have a couple of 5/5s. We could tap, Vine Reap Mentor and Ravenous Squirrel to give 2 of these guys trample. I mean, next turn we can start tapping them to give others trample. But I mean, Menace and Trample as a 9/9, I feel like it's going to end up hitting somebody. Again, I kind of like the idea of tapping 2 to give 2 more of these trample and just attack in, and I have a feeling that all 3 of them should hit. A 9/9 and 2 7/7s with odd acorns +2/+2 and trample, I'm sure are going to hit someone with them having menace. And look, we draw the Nuka-Cola, we draw Warren Soul Trader, which is a sack outlet. I like this. I think we're building up towards a good next turn. So we'll go into turn 8. Now, all of these squirrels are online, ready to attack. Get the swamp. There could be a world where we just meat hook here for whatever's needed to just wipe us a really good section of the board. But I kind of would like to try to see if I can find myself a way to get another food, and Nuka-Cola vending machine is one of those ways. So tap 3 for the vending machine. Pay 1 and tap it to make a food, right? And that's going to actually, right, remember, make 2 foods because of the parallel lives. I've got 4 mana left, perfectly enough for this 3-tree city, and I've got 4, 7, 13 squirrels. Let's see. I guess, let's think about this. I was going to say the color of the mana probably doesn't particularly matter, right? And the cool part is I'm getting a bunch more squirrels. I don't think the color of the mana matters. We'll say black just in case I want to do this Eviscerator's Insight. But basically what I'm thinking here is I just said I had 13 mana. We use 3 of it for the Soul Trader just in case we want to go deep here. But we would forage, right? This is going to make 2 squirrels, right? Everything gets a counter. Forage again. 2 more squirrels. Remember, when we get rid of those, foods, we're going to make tap treasures. So then that's another thing we could potentially use on the next turn. But I mean, here my thought process is use these ones that are smaller to give the bigger ones trample. And I mean, we're probably at the world where we either knock at least 1 person out or go towards knocking 2 people out here and just, brutalize the board. On end step, we can make a rhino if we want to. But the truth is, even if we use these 4 to give, 4 of these trample, or use, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to give 1, 2, 3, 4, and maybe 1 of these, or, give these guys trample. Hit him, we're going to draw a bunch of cards. But the truth is we probably knock at least 1 player out, potentially run the risk of knocking a second player out. And again, I think this is what Camellia is trying to do. So let me know, what do you think of Camellia down in the comment section below. I like this deck. I like the idea of the going wide and really taking advantage of squirrels going wide with the foods instead of the more combo-centric-y Chatterfang list that I made. I think if you're looking for more of a higher power one, Chatterfang makes sense, whereas if you're looking for more of a fun with Squirrels deck, I think this one makes more sense. But I'd love to know what you think down in the comment section below, and I will catch you guys next time.